sound a little irrational. Sound a little irrational.
Hello, Earthlings, and welcome back to Sound Mind. It's been forever since I did one of these vlogs, but it's back. It's weekly again. I don't have any school getting in the way. Speaking of school, in this particular vlog I'm going to be talking about some of my favorite teachers at Berklee College of Music, from which I graduated last month. But it does feel a bit weird calling them teachers, let alone professors, since most of them are musicians themselves or somehow involved with music. I mean, the liberal arts department has the biggest population of non-musicians, but pretty much every other department is filled with musicians, and I'm considering songwriters musicians. You kind of have to know how at least one instrument works in order to write a song, other than voice. I mean, if you can find a counterexample, leave it in the comments. But anyway, let's get started. So I guess we should probably begin at the beginning. Matt Jensen was the only Berklee faculty member I knew when I came there, having met him at Jazz Camp West a couple months before. Yeah. I guess I was lucky I did when I did, because he's one of those jazz camp staff that they bring back every 4 or 3 years or so. He ended up becoming my first private instructor, which was, nice to get lessons from someone I knew. Like me, he's also a singer-songwriter, although he does mainly reggae. He has his band, the Liquid Revolution. He leads the Berklee Bob Marley Ensemble. He actually, one anecdote I remember him telling me is that there was some jam going on at Jazz Camp West, and Jovino Santos Neto, who's another pianist who's regularly on the staff there, and Jovino wanted to play a xochi tune, which is a Brazilian style that swings like reggae, and Matt was on the drums, so he asked him to just play a reggae beat, and it of course worked. Well, I say of course, I've listened to some xochi since, but yeah, it was fun studying with Matt. I just kind of wish that I'd switched teachers earlier, because they make you do 4 semesters of lessons. If I had switched after 2 semesters, I could have sort of had 2 semesters of Matt and 2 semesters of Doug Johnson, who I switched to, who has a really different style. I mean, unlike Matt and me, he isn't a singer or a composer, so he's really focused on the pianistic aspect of things. I really grew a lot under Doug in really different ways than under Matt. Doug is really interested in the physiological aspect of technique, a bit more so than the actual choice of notes. He actually has a skeleton in his room, which he actually demonstrates these physiological functions on for the hands. Interesting thing Doug taught me is that, or reminded me of, or something like that, is the thumb doesn't end here. When the skin joins up, the bone still continues, and it doesn't join up with the rest of the hand until the wrist. So you have all this room to move it in, which is handy when you're playing scales, when you're playing things really fast and you have all this space to move your thumb. That's probably one of the more valuable lessons Doug taught me about playing piano. I did take an extra semester of lessons just so I could take 2 semesters with Doug, but unfortunately, because I wasn't a performance major, I couldn't a 5th proficiency exam at the end of my 5th semester of lessons. But it was fun. Anyway, back to my first semester, my other favorite teacher from that semester was Scott Diogburn, my ear training teacher. I tested right into ear training 4, which is the last level of ear training, but I was in a class specifically designed for first semesters, because when you start out with ear training, they teach you the solfege syllables, and by the time you get to ear training 4, having done 1 through 3, the solfege stuff is going to be in your blood. But for us, it wasn't, so a lot of the first part of ear training 4 for me was getting the solfege, in my bloodstream. I don't remember much about that class, because it was so far back in time. It was only my first semester there. But Scott is a pretty funny guy. One thing we learned movable do solfege, where do is always the tonic of whatever key you're in, as opposed to fixed do, where do is always the note C, regardless of what degree of the scale it is. But with movable do, the note that's do can change throughout a piece if it modulates. He had this joke about you know how movable do is handy because you could just go do 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 do. That's one for the music theory nerds. Moving on, my ensemble, my first semester actually did 2 final performances instead of 1 with some other Berklee ensembles. At our first performance, one of the other ones was led by a guy called John Paul. Yes, that is his full name. A guy with a strong New England accent and a guy who kind of looks like Tim Curry and just an all-around funny guy. It's hard to describe him, but he's probably one of the most fun ensemble leaders at Berklee. I resolved to eventually take an ensemble with him, which I did my 3rd semester, the rock jam band, which happened to coincide with my obsession with Fish, the band, not the singer. Yeah, he taught us a lot about how to jam. It's not just improvising on a groove. Of course you have to listen to everyone and you have to hear everyone before you can listen to them. When to be tight and when to be loose. I sometimes called him dubstep because when we messed up, he'd go, whoa, 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 whoa. And it was always kind of funny to hear his strong New England accent. Bring in a chat. That's supposed to be bring in a chart. I met quite a few people I'm still friends with through that ensemble, which I'll be talking more about in the next SoundMind vlog where I talk about actual students I met at Berklee. It seems weird to call them students because we're musicians first and foremost. I mean, it's Berklee College of Music. I majored in jazz composition, and the first few classes I took specific to that major happened to all be taught by Bill Sissom, who has retired by now. He's kind of a funny guy in his own way. I took chord scale voicings and a survey class, a survey of jazz composition and arranging. You know, he pointed out salient characteristics of different arrangers throughout the history of jazz. I'm forgetting a name he talked about. It's some arranger who he arranges in what might be called a Chekhov's gun style. That's just a name I came up with just now, but I wish I could remember his name right now. He starts with a motive and then he keeps on blatantly coming back to that motive several times throughout the arrangement. Bill Holman, that's who it is. Around the same time, my 3rd semester, I was playing in a project band, which is an ensemble that is put together and led by a Berklee professor to play students' homework, and they can submit things to be played and they can hear their mistakes or lack thereof. My 3rd semester it was led by Scott Free, who was a really nice guy. We really got along. So in my 4th semester I took Jazz Composition 1 with him. I ended up taking Jazz Composition 2 and Jazz Counterpoint 2 with him, mainly because he was the only one that was teaching them at a time. I know that there were 2 Jazz Comp 2 classes, and one of them conflicted with my ensemble, and he was pretty good. I wrote some of my best jazz tunes in his Jazz Comp 1 class. There was kind of a bit less writing in his Jazz Comp 2 class, because it was only really 2 big pieces, one of which was an arrangement of the last tune we wrote for Jazz Comp 1, and then a sort of extended 5-minute piece. Joe Mulholland is a guy I took 3 different harmony classes with. Great guy. The first class I took was reharmonization techniques, where he basically talked about, well, a reharmonization is a thing jazz composers sometimes do, where they take a tune and they write new chords to the melody. One of the more eye-opening, or closer to eye-opening pieces in that class that we looked at was Carla Bley's song called Time and Us. It used the 7 dominant 7 chord to resolve to the 1. Your standard dominant resolution is 5-1, where it goes down a 5th. But in the case of 7-1, it goes up a half step. So it sounds a bit more chromatic and a bit more exotic, for want of a better word. A bit more sexy, I guess. Yeah, that's a much better word than exotic. And then I took advanced modal harmony with him. That was a fun class as well. He's a fun guy. I hope I am aptly describing the class. In modal harmony, there are no wrong notes, even when you're looking at modes of the major scale, which are some pretty common modes. And then only in my last semester, which just ended, I took harmony in Brazilian song, and that opened my mind to so many Brazilian composers I had been sleeping on, especially Chico Buarque, Gilberto Gil, Milton Nascimento, Ginga, a more modern MPB songwriter. But that was in my 8th semester. Jumping back to my 5th semester, I was taking the prog rock instrumental ensemble, and that was led by John Finn, a brilliant guitarist, a brilliant band leader, always really chill about stuff. You know, he didn't call any of us out for making mistakes. I mean, it's a prog ensemble. You're supposed to be technically gifted or aware of what being technically gifted sounds like. And I mean, that was a really fun class. Made a lot of friends in it. One major thing I learned from that is that when you yell at a bandmate, you're going to be the next one to do whatever they just did. So you're basically displaying pointless anger or something like that. The next two people I had on my cheat sheet that I'm using to make this video are something I might call one of Berklee's faculty power couples, but then again, I don't exactly know what a power couple is. Jeff Clausen and Einan Serto. I had Jeff for a couple classes. I first had him for the music of Duke Ellington. I almost had him for Harmony 4 my 3rd semester, because my Harmony 3 teacher decided I was intensive Harmony 4 material. Whether or not I actually turned out to be is anyone's guess, because I signed up for one of Jeff's intensive Harmony 4 classes, but it got canceled at the last minute because I don't think there were enough people in it, so I took a regular Harmony 4 class, which didn't seem to below my level at all. I had Jeff for the music of Duke Ellington class. I learned quite a bit about Ellington and what separated him from the other artists, because he didn't just write tunes, he also wrote extended pieces. We learned about the important people and the underrated people like Jimmy Blanford, who wasn't with him a very long time, but he had such a melodic way of playing and such a rich tone, which contrasted to his predecessor's style so much that for a time he had 2 bassists. Obviously Billy Strayhorn, we talked about him a lot. We actually watched a clip of a time when Ellington actually brought out Strayhorn to play piano on a song for like an encore or something, and he made sure he was standing right in Billy's line of sight so he couldn't see Johnny Hodges counting his money instead of playing, or Paul Gonsalves nodding off. I had Einan Serto as my directed study, which mainly consisted of her guiding me as I wrote my 10-minute 12-tone funk metal mishmash thing piece, Shwiska Shwi, which was a complete redo of my Jazz Composition 3 final, which wasn't very good, and then we revised it to be pretty damn good. It definitely wouldn't have been as good without Ein's guidance. We definitely clicked during what little time we spent working together. I also had Jeff later in the professional development seminar class, which is basically just a bunch of students talking about putting themselves out there, whatever that means. It means something different for everyone else. And that was a really good class. In the first half of that semester, we actually listened to 2 pieces of music every day and wrote down our reactions to them, and then had to read them out word for word, just to prepare us for any prospective careers in music journalism. Greg Hopkins was my Jazz Comp 3 teacher, and then I also took post-bop harmonic innovation with him the next semester. He's a household name in the Jazz Comp department. He taught us a bunch of techniques in both classes, a bunch of writing techniques that I forget a lot of off the top of my head, but it's like pretty much every week he'd talk about some new way of developing something like a kind of canon or major third, or he'd show us some Bartok piece. He'd demonstrate it on the piano and then laugh because it sounded so good or weird or whatever. I probably learned a lot from him. I'm not really aware of what I'm learning when I'm learning it all that much, but he was one of my favorites, at least in my 6th semester. Another teacher I had in my 6th semester, another really good one, was Ben Camp, who couldn't be more different. I had him for Lyric Writing 1. That was kind of when I was getting more comfortable being a singer-songwriter. And lyrics have always been, I guess, my weak point. Yeah, my weak point. They're my weak point. They're often the last thing I'll start when writing a song. He taught us a lot of different things about, writing effective lyrics and writing out three boxes because you've got a concept for the lyric, but you want it to write it out in three boxes with each one growing more intense, not necessarily for three verses, but for the idea to grow less vague, and grow more emotionally intense. We also learned about putting words that relate to the concept of the song at the ends of lines, and also being able to say the hook at the end of every line and have it make sense. We both looked at Thriller for examples of both. Like if you say every line of the first verse and then you say this is Thriller afterwards, it always relates to the concept. And also if you look at the last words of the lines, which are the words that rhyme, midnight, dark, moonlight, they all relate to the concept of a thriller. Later on I had him for a course, I call it political songwriting. It was officially called Special Topics in Songwriting, but with the current political climate, pretty much everything we talked about was political, and it gave us a nice break from music to just talk about politics, although I was not the most conversationally engaged in the class. But I did learn a lot from that. I also learned a lot from watching Ben teach. Even though I was his student, I was watching him teach, and if I ever become a teacher, I want to become at least somewhat like him, because, well, he's kind of like John Finn in that he manages to stay chill for the entire class, even when talking about some really heavy stuff. He's also a master at playing devil's advocate, which was exemplified one day when we were talking about Rachel Dolezal. He tried to play the role of someone who's justifying her, and we actually found it quite hard to put into words this thing that we know is wrong for a white woman to pretend to be black and say she identifies as black when you can't just change your race like you change your gender. But anyway, let's move on to someone else, Ken Zambello. He has another teaching style I kind of hope to emulate. It's more no-nonsense than chill. It's another way of showing that you really know what you're doing. I first had him for analysis of prog rock. He's a guy who does a lot of stuff because he works a lot with singers showcases. He was one of the main arrangers in the commencement concert. I also had him for the Music of Lilith Fair ensemble, which is a far cry from the prog rock analysis class, which was an all male class happened to be, while the Lilith Fair ensemble was pretty gender balanced. He does a few Spinal Tap references. Like he always has to say 11, like Spinal Tap or D minor. Also, like me, he has a major interest in several genres of music, which has kind of helped him to be in sort of every field of Berklee. Mark Rossi is a guy I had for a fusion composition arranging class, and then because he mentioned his Indian music techniques class, I also took that. Fusion gave me a deeper love for groups like the Mahavishnu Orchestra and Weather Report, and then Indian music techniques pretty much taught me everything I know about Indian music, like what a raga actually is. It's like a scale with certain notes that can only go in certain directions, and the vast differences between Hindustani and Carnatic music. He said it was like the difference between Baroque and Romantic music, with Hindustani being Romantic. There's a lot more improvisation that goes on in it, probably because of the larger influence of Sufi poetry. We didn't always talk about Indian music, we talked about some other stuff, like once we got off on a tangent about Terry Riley and microtonal music, which I mean, they do use microtones in Indian music. It isn't even tempered. Suzanne Dean is a teacher I had, who taught, among other things, 20th century women songwriters. Well, specifically in that class, we focused on Dorothy Fields, Laura Nero, Carole King, and Joni Mitchell, and that was a fun class, not just because of Suzanne, but because of the amalgamation of talented songwriters that happened to be in the class with me. We had a lot of writing assignments. We had a lot of presentations in the class, and one of the options was often to write a song. I almost always chose the song option. It definitely gave me a deeper love for the four women we specifically studied, and I think we all wrote some of our best songs in that class. And then in my final year, I became an accompanist with the voice department at Berklee, so I started accompanying a lot of vocal classes. In the fall, I accompanied one of Jeannie Gagne's ensembles. That was a really fun class. What I like about Jeannie is that she's one of those singers who doesn't sound like a different person when they sing. I've noticed some singers, I'm not naming any names because I have no idea what their names are in the first place, but I don't know, they talk like regular people and then they sing something and it sounds either robotic or soulful and robotic at the same time, but I don't know, it just doesn't sound like them. It's like they go from normal to perfect in 0 seconds flat or something. Maybe not perfect, but like overly polished or something. I like singers who sing like they talk but sing well. I'm not claiming to sing well myself. Joey Blake was another guy whose classes I'm accompanying, another Bay Area guy. He's another guy who sings like he talks. I accompanied a class of his in the fall and in the spring. They were the same class, Rhythm Section Grooves. A big thing I got from accompanying those classes, besides having fun playing students' mistakes when they made them, because it's teaching you how to write charts for a rhythm section when you've never done it before. And in Joey's case, he makes all of his students use Finale to write their charts. But one major thing I got from that class is that pop is not a style. Pop is not a style, it is a measure of how many people like your music and are buying it. People miscategorize songs because of what they know the artist who's doing it for. Like he talked about how I Just Called to Say I Love You is a country ballad, but because it's played by Stevie Wonder on a bunch of synths, it gets classified as R&B. That was a fun class. I also accompanied one of those classes in the spring taught by Jody Jenkins, and she teaches it in a really different way to Joey. Like he goes by different styles, she goes by different subdivisions, which is how you divide the beat, like straight eighths, swing eighths, or straight sixteenths, or swing sixteenths, or triplets. And she also made all of her students do their charts by hand, so I guess it's good to know both. I also had a lot of fun in that class playing both well-written and not so well-written charts. Basically, for those classes, they have a full rhythm section, piano, guitar, bass, and drums, and they sing their charts with them, and we're supposed to play it exactly how they've written rather than how we know the song goes. Especially if we don't know the song, because then we're just relying on their chart. But that was fun. Another class I accompanied was a thing called Elements of Vocal Technique for Non-Singers, taught by Claire McLeod. And I really learned a lot of stuff about singing. Even though I wasn't a student in that class, I was still a non-singer who sings, a non-voice principal who sings. Like Doug Johnson, who I mentioned earlier, she taught us a lot about the physiological aspects of singing. My favorite one was the velum, which it's what makes the difference between a nasal vowel, a regular vowel, and a nasal consonant. It can be low, medium, or high, and if it's high, that's a regular vowel like ah, and if it's medium, it'll be a nasal vowel like ah. If it's low, then it's it's just a nasal consonant. There's no air going through your mouth. I don't know why I opened it just then. You can just And she happens to be married to Pat Pattison, who he's kind of a household name in the songwriting department at Berklee. He also wrote the book Writing Better Lyrics. He's that famous, I don't really need to say that much about him. I took his Poetry 1 class in the spring, and he's one of those people where you kind of learn the same things no matter what class you're taking, because he has so much knowledge inside of him that it just ends up spilling out no matter what class you're taking with him. One thing I definitely gleaned from him, other than a love of the verb glean, is basically the knowledge that there are only, in poetry as in music, there are only 3 harmonic functions: tonic, dominant, and subdominant, also known as being at home, and not going anywhere, kind of going somewhere, but it's not home. You don't know where you're going, but you don't have a desire to go. That is the most wordy description of a subdominant function you will ever hear in your life. Yeah, it's a contrast between being at home, going home, and leaving home. Tonic, dominant, subdominant. As it was a music school and he was a songwriter, it made sense to use musical analogs to talk about poetry to us. You know, tonic fulfills people's expectations, dominant sets up expectations, and subdominant doesn't set up expectations. That's probably the best description I've heard of the three functions. That's where the musicality, or I guess the artfulness, comes, you know, in the violation of expectation. If I stayed at Berklee a bit longer, well, for one thing, I might have majored in jazz comp and songwriting, and I would probably have taken one of Pat's songwriting classes. I've only got two more teachers mentioned on my cheat sheet. One of them is Alex Ludwig, who I had for a class called Modernism and the Arts, which was almost entirely spent on modernist composers like Schoenberg, Berg, Webern, also Wagner. We actually talked quite a lot about Wagner and how they were modernist, and he's another one of those really knowledgeable professors because apparently he teaches a course in the Beatles as well. And our final project for the class was to write an essay on some modernist artist outside the modernist period. Could be earlier, could be later. I actually wrote mine on the Smiths and REM and how they were modernists in the field of rock music. I think it's one of the best things, one of the best non-musical things I've written. The final name on the cheat sheet is Jamie Lynn Hart. I accompanied her pop rock country vocal ensemble my last semester at Berklee, and it's probably the greatest amount of friends I've made in a single class. I mean, it's like absolutely everyone, including the other accompanists and me, was an integral part of the class. Like, if one of them had left, it would completely have altered the dynamic. There really weren't any shy students in the class. At least not by the end. Not that much in the beginning either. We've talked about having a reunion. I mean, at this point, it's kind of been a joke. I don't know if it was a joke. I want to have a complete reunion sometime with that class. It's hard to describe in words, especially since I haven't written anything down about any of these people. But that is it for this Sound Mind. Next week I'm going to talk about some of my favorite students I met at Berklee during my time there. But until then, Gafaba.